Most people look at the Middle East and think they already understand its biggest challenges. They imagine endless oil fields, political conflicts, and temperatures that turn entire regions into ovens by midday. What they rarely think about is the one crisis quietly shaping the future of every country in the region: water. In a part of the world where rainfall keeps dropping and summers get hotter every year, water has become the new currency of survival. Rivers that once fed civilizations are shrinking faster than governments can respond. Lakes that appeared on maps for centuries are now fading into pale outlines, the way old memories disappear from a photograph. And behind these shrinking blue spaces are millions of people caught in a slow emergency that is gathering speed. Yet there is one place in the middle of this increasingly dry landscape that seems to be resisting the trend. One country that refuses to accept the idea that living in a desert means living at the mercy of nature. This video tells the story of how that country flipped its water destiny from scarcity to abundance. And before we step into how they achieved this, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes where engineering choices don't just fix problems but reshape the fate of entire nations. To understand Israel's achievement, you first need to see the full map of the region as it stands today. Because the water crisis surrounding Israel is not a future prediction. It's a present-day reality unfolding across the Middle East with a speed that surprises even the scientists who study it. What used to be rare dry spells have become permanent droughts in large areas. Temperatures that once shocked meteorologists are now routinely surpassed in the summer. And the deep groundwater reservoirs built up through thousands of years of natural processes are collapsing in a matter of decades. It's the kind of degradation that normally happens over geological time, yet here it is unfolding within a single human lifetime. Iran is one of the clearest examples of how bad things have become. This is a country with proud agricultural traditions and a population that depends heavily on homegrown food. But with more than 80 million people competing for dwindling freshwater supplies, the system is grinding toward collapse. In recent years, Iran's president openly warned the public that if rainfall failed to arrive soon, the government might have to evacuate Tehran. Think about that for a moment. A capital city approaching 9 million residents being forced to relocate because there may not be enough water to keep it functioning. That announcement was not a political statement meant to provoke fear. It was a sober admission that the reservoirs keeping the country alive are reaching dangerously low levels. Wells that served entire communities for generations have dried out completely. Farmers who once irrigated their lands with confidence now watch their orchards and fields wither after decades of productivity. Further west, Iraq faces a similar crisis. This is the land shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, two rivers that fed one of the earliest civilizations in human history. These rivers helped build cities, enabled farming, and inspired some of the oldest written stories humanity has. Today, both rivers carry less than half the volume they did just a few decades ago. As the waters decline, Iraq's agricultural backbone is weakening. Farmers who planted wheat and barley for centuries are now abandoning fields long before harvest season because nothing survives the dry heat. And then there is Basra, a city that once thrived as a major port. Today, seawater has begun pushing up the rivers and into the freshwater system, turning tap water so salty that families cannot drink it without risking their health. When a city near the coast starts tasting the ocean in its taps, it means the crisis is moving far faster than the country's institutions can adapt. The story does not improve when you move north. Syria, already torn apart by more than a decade of conflict, faces a second crisis layered on top of the first. War destroyed infrastructure that would have been essential in a drought: canals, pumping stations, water treatment systems, irrigation pipelines. These losses have turned fertile lands into dry patches where dust storms now rise like warnings from the earth. Farmers who once fed entire regions have been reduced to watching their livelihoods collapse. Drought combines with conflict to produce a level of instability that spills over borders. Even Turkey, the country sitting at the source of many regional rivers, is not safe from the trend. Vast areas of the Konya Plain have seen groundwater fall so sharply that sinkholes the size of buildings occasionally open up overnight. Farmers wake up to find massive craters where their crops once grew. And the problem is not limited to rural regions. Major cities like Istanbul and Izmir are marching toward chronic water stress, where the yearly demand for water exceeds the supply almost every season. Engineers and planners in Turkey are already discussing the possibility of expensive pipelines and emergency measures because traditional water sources can no longer be relied on. Jordan, one of the driest countries on Earth, faces even harsher numbers. The country survives on less than 200 cubic meters of water per person per year, which is far below what the United Nations considers a minimum for stable living conditions. Meanwhile, Yemen's long conflict has pushed its water situation into a category of its own. In many places, water is more valuable than oil because the systems needed to access clean water have either been destroyed or fallen apart. Imagine living at the center of this landscape. A region where almost every neighbor is fighting a losing battle against heat, drought, and limited water reserves. Now imagine that, in the middle of all this, there is one country moving in a completely different direction. A country that once shared the same bleak outlook but decided it would refuse that fate. Instead of dust, it has managed to grow fruits, vegetables, and vineyards in the desert. Instead of relying entirely on nature, it produces drinking water on demand. Instead of fearing wastewater, it transforms it into one of its most valuable national resources. That country is Israel. Israel's water journey is not the result of being naturally blessed with rivers or large freshwater lakes. It is the result of seeing a crisis early, treating it as an engineering challenge, and designing systems that work even when nature does not cooperate. Today, roughly 80% of Israel's drinking water comes from desalination plants along the Mediterranean coast. The majority of the remaining supply comes from treated and recycled wastewater. And when you look at the numbers, one figure stands out more than anything. Israel recycles around 94% of the wastewater produced by its citizens. To understand how extraordinary that is, consider that the second highest wastewater recycler in the world is Spain, which recycles roughly a quarter of its wastewater. Israel's number is almost 4 times that. And it's not recycling for the sake of statistics. About 87% of that treated wastewater goes directly to farms to support food production on land that would otherwise be unusable. With these systems working together, Israel stands today as a desert nation that is fully self-sufficient in drinking water and almost fully self-sufficient in agriculture. But reaching that point took decades of planning, frustration, and experimentation. Israel's natural water profile has always been challenging. The north receives decent rainfall, but central regions get much less, and the south, the vast Negev desert, barely receives any at all. For most of the 20th century, the country relied heavily on the Sea of Galilee and several underground aquifers. That model worked when the population was smaller and agriculture was limited. But as cities expanded, farming demands increased, and the climate became hotter and drier, the pressure on natural water sources pushed them to the edge. By the late 1990s, the Sea of Galilee reached levels so low that engineers worried it would become permanently damaged. Aquifers across the country dropped to historic lows. Israel was on the same trajectory many neighboring countries are on now. The difference is that Israel chose not to stay on that path. The turning point arrived when the country decided to treat water scarcity as a problem of engineering rather than a fixed limit imposed by geography. This mindset shift can be traced back to a scientist named Alexander Zarkin in the 1960s. At a time when many believed desalination was too expensive or too experimental to be useful, Zarkin proposed freezing seawater under vacuum conditions. When seawater freezes, salt separates from the ice crystals. Melt the ice afterward, and you have fresh water. It was not perfect, it was not cheap, and it was not efficient, but it opened an entirely new way of thinking. Zarkin eventually founded IDE Technologies, which would become a global leader in desalination and play a major role in shaping the water industry. His early work paved the way for Israel to embrace reverse osmosis. This technology relies on pushing seawater through a membrane so thin that water molecules can pass through but salt cannot. The idea was known internationally, but Israel took it from a laboratory concept to a national pillar of survival. The first major reverse osmosis plant opened in Eilat in 1997. It wasn't large, but it worked. And once it proved reliable, it changed the nation's water policy almost overnight. By the early 2000s, Israel found itself facing the kind of drought that forces governments to choose between bold action and national decline. Rainfall dropped to historic lows. The Sea of Galilee flirted with what engineers called the Black Line, a point where the lake's ecosystem could collapse. Groundwater levels sank so far that many aquifers risked permanent damage from saltwater intrusion. At this point, hesitation would have meant long-term water rationing, agricultural collapse, and the same desperation visible across the region. Instead of waiting for nature to return to normal, the government made a decision that would define the country's future. It approved a nationwide wave of desalination plants, pipelines, pumping stations, and distribution networks capable of supplying the entire country with reliable drinking water. This wasn't a small adjustment. It was one of the most aggressive water engineering responses ever attempted in a drought-stricken nation. In 2005, the Ashkelon plant opened along the Mediterranean. At the time, it was one of the largest reverse osmosis facilities on the planet, and it became proof that desalination could be scaled to meet national demand. Ashkelon could produce 15,000 cubic meters of drinking water per hour, an output that stunned many experts outside Israel. From there, the country did not slow down. The Had-Era plant came online in 2009, offering even greater capacity. Then came one of the most influential facilities in modern water engineering, the Sorek desalination plant, completed in 2013. Sorek was built with enormous pressure vessels arranged in a vertical configuration that made the entire operation more efficient and easier to maintain. At full capacity, Sorek produced more than 200 million cubic meters of fresh water annually, enough to supply a large portion of the country on its own. And Israel did not stop at these three. Additional plants were added along the coastline, creating a chain of facilities capable of replacing almost all traditional water sources. As these plants grew in number, something remarkable happened. Israel went from fearing the disappearance of its lakes to injecting water back into the environment. The Sea of Galilee, which for years slipped deeper into drought levels, now receives desalinated water through the reverse national water carrier system. Pipes designed to bring water from the lake to central and southern regions can now push water the other way, stabilizing its level and restoring ecological balance. It is a complete inversion of the country's earlier fears, and it shows how engineering can change a nation's relationship with its natural landscape. Of course, none of this came without cost. The Ashkelon facility required around $250 million to build. Had-Era cost well over $400 million. Sorek reached nearly $450 million. The newer Sorek 2 plant exceeds $500 million on its own. And those figures only reflect construction. They do not include the long network of pipes that cross the country, the high-pressure pumping stations that push water uphill, the reservoirs built to store fresh water, or the constant maintenance needed to keep membranes clean and efficient. Even with these enormous investments, Israel now produces desalinated water for roughly 54 cents per cubic meter. That cost makes the system viable for large-scale national use, and it is one of the reasons other countries look to Israel for guidance. But desalination is only half of Israel's water revolution. If the country relied solely on desalinated water, agriculture would become far too expensive. Farmers would be forced to pay prices that would make local food uncompetitive. So instead of choosing between drinking water and farming, Israel built a second system that works alongside desalination. This is the Wastewater Recycling Network, and it is one of the most advanced on Earth. At its center is the Shafdan wastewater treatment plant near Tel Aviv. Every day, Shafdan receives hundreds of millions of liters of sewage. It treats this wastewater through a multi-stage system that removes contaminants, nutrients, and organic matter. Most countries stop there, but Israel takes the process further by channeling the treated water into underground sand aquifers. The sand acts as a natural filter, removing even more impurities while stabilizing the water's chemical composition. After this additional filtering, the water is pumped south through a series of pipelines and distributed across farms in the Negev desert. The quality is so high that farmers can use it to grow fruits, vegetables, and flowers for export. Strict guidelines regulate every aspect of this system. Salinity levels are monitored to protect soil health. Heavy metals and chemical residues are measured constantly to ensure crop safety. As a result, wastewater becomes not a burden but a dependable agricultural resource. And because Israel recycles more than 90% of its wastewater, the country does not have to pull agricultural water from lakes or natural aquifers. This separation between agricultural water and drinking water is one of the greatest strengths of the entire system. When you step back and look at the full picture, what becomes clear is that Israel built resilience by creating redundancy. If one source fails, others can compensate. If rainfall collapses for multiple years, desalination takes over. If desalination plants reduce output temporarily, the wastewater recycling network covers agriculture. If a lake drops too low, the national system pushes water back into it. Everything connects. Everything supports everything else. And everything is designed with the assumption that nature may not provide what the country needs. This approach has broader implications beyond Israel. As drought intensifies across the Middle East, the question facing the region is no longer whether countries will need new water strategies. The question is whether they will adopt them quickly enough. Israel's model does not fit every nation perfectly, but its principles apply almost everywhere. The first principle is to accept that relying solely on natural water sources is no longer sustainable in many arid regions. The second is to treat water infrastructure as essential national security, not as a secondary utility. The third is to combine multiple solutions instead of expecting a single technology to solve everything. These are lessons that took decades to learn in Israel but can be adapted by others immediately. There are challenges, of course. Desalination consumes energy, and even with modern reverse osmosis membranes, the process requires high pressure and constant upkeep. Countries looking to copy Israel's model must either build strong energy infrastructure or rely on renewable sources like solar power. Membranes eventually wear out and must be replaced. Electrical systems need upgrades. Pipes must be inspected. Pumping stations require routine attention. These ongoing costs never disappear. But when weighed against the alternative, the choice becomes clear. A country without water faces economic collapse, mass migration, food shortages, and political instability. A reliable water system, even an expensive one, prevents those outcomes. Israel's experience also shows the importance of timing. The country built its systems before the crisis reached an irreversible stage. It invested in research, collaborated with private companies, encouraged scientists to experiment, and introduced policies that incentivized new solutions. Many nations wait until the crisis becomes overwhelming before acting, and by then the cost becomes far greater. Israel demonstrates the value of anticipating failure rather than reacting to it. Another lesson comes from public acceptance. Early desalination projects faced criticism from citizens who feared the taste of desalinated water or believed the plants would damage the coastline. Over time, as the water became more reliable and the benefits became obvious, public resistance faded. Today, most Israelis drink desalinated water without even thinking about it. This shift in public perception is crucial because water projects of this scale require national commitment, long-term funding, and support that survives political changes. The agricultural sector also had to adapt. Farmers were initially skeptical about using treated wastewater, and some worried about how the shift would affect soil quality. But the consistency of supply, combined with the strict regulatory standards, made the system dependable. Over time, wastewater-based irrigation became a cornerstone of the economy, allowing Israel to produce year-round and export crops despite its harsh climate. While Israel's system is robust, it still requires vigilance. Engineers continue working on ways to reduce energy consumption in desalination. Researchers are experimenting with new membranes that last longer, resist fouling, and operate at lower pressure. Policymakers monitor population growth and adjust water allocations to avoid overloading the infrastructure. The country understands that even with a strong system, complacency can undo progress. But the most powerful message from this entire journey is that scarcity does not have to define a nation's destiny. Israel started with the same challenges its neighbors face now: limited rainfall, shrinking lakes, and rising temperatures. Instead of accepting that future, the country chose to reshape it. Through planning, engineering, scientific innovation, and a willingness to invest early, Israel turned a bleak water forecast into a model of sustainability. And as the world becomes hotter and more unpredictable, these lessons matter far beyond the region. Cities in North America, Southern Europe, South Asia, and parts of Africa are already facing similar pressures. The strategies Israel adopted could help prevent future crises elsewhere. The idea is not that every country must copy Israel exactly. The lesson is that long-term water security requires courage, investment, and a readiness to try methods that once seemed too ambitious. The story ends with a simple truth. Water is not just a resource. It is stability. It is food security. It is national survival. And it is a reminder that engineering, when guided by clear vision and determination, can change the direction of an entire country. Israel's transformation does not solve the global water crisis, but it proves that even the driest landscape can be reshaped with the right strategy. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. More stories are coming that explore how engineering, policy, and innovation shape the world we depend on.